Good day, everybody. But come on now. Today is better than a good day. Today is a great day. Today is a spectacular day because Team Canada wins the Four Nations face-off. And in doing so, confirm and defend our status as the greatest hockey-playing nation in the world. In fact, it was so unbelievably fantastic, beyond anyone's expectation, it actually becomes reasonable to ask, where does the Four Nations face-off rank among the all-time greatest moments in the history of Canadian hockey? And that, my friends, is a question that would be my pleasure to try to answer. I mean, this is going to be great fun for me. I get to talk about all my favorite things. I get to talk about history. I get to talk about science. I'm going to talk about art. I'm going to weave them all into talking about hockey. My goodness, what a video this is going to be. So here we go. Let's answer this most important of all life's questions. So, folks, what if I told you that as spectacular as the Four Nations face-off was, and it was spectacular, don't get me wrong, but what if I told you it's still actually nowhere close to the single greatest moment in the history of Canadian hockey, which is, of course, the 1972 Canada-Russia Summit Series. As a general rule, I love preserving the stories of old-time hockey. And I'll take any opportunity I can get to talk about the 1972 series. In fact, I have been doing so since my high school public speaking assignment. This is the book that was the source of much of the information I used to write that assignment. Remains a great reference to this day. In subsequent years, after they invented DVDs, this is the box set of all 8 games of this series that I've since watched and rewatched. And this is the most recent thing that I've read about the series. Someone gave me this book for Christmas a couple of years ago. It's by Scott Morrison, another great reference. And folks, these are just a few of the many. In fact, there's nothing in hockey that has such a rich array of books and films and documentaries made about it. And that in itself might give you some indication to the magnitude, to the richness of this series. Really, folks, it's pure theater. Now, for the benefit of those of you that are not familiar with this series, I'm going to do something for you that really, folks, pains my soul. And I'm going to abbreviate this unbelievable series into jot note form. Ready? Here's the summary. So, the Soviets have won the last 3 consecutive Olympics. They've supposedly got a few players who might be okay. Harlamov, Yakushev, and some goalie named Tretiak. So the powers that be schedule an 8-game series, 4 in Canada, 4 in the Soviet Union. The predictions are that Canada, with this lineup of NHL All-Stars, are going to win every single game. So they start game 1, and Canada scores in the first 30 seconds. And then they score again after 6 minutes. And everyone's thinking, yeah, right, this is going to be stupid. But then the Soviets get their act together, and they win the first game 7-3. By the time all 4 games have been played in Canada, we are losing the series. And in the final game before the team heads overseas, the fans literally boo Team Canada off the ice. In an interview immediately post-game, Phil Esposito gives the best speech since the Sermon on the Mount. If you have never seen this speech, I suggest you go Google it. And honestly, with all this stuff going on in the world today, I defy you not to feel patriotic after you watch Phil Esposito give this speech. So the series moves to Russia, and Canada lose again. So now there's only 3 games left. No more room for error. They've got to win all 3. They do win. Game 6, Paul Henderson scores the game-winning goal. They win Game 7. Paul Henderson scores the game-winning goal. And then there's Game 8. Theater? If it was theater, if it was fiction, you'd be accused of making it unbelievable. So the game starts. In the first 4 minutes, Canada takes 3 penalties. It looks like the referee is against Team Canada. And so J.P. Parise tries to kill that referee. A riot nearly breaks out. Canada's trainer is given 10,000 Russian fans the double bird. They eventually start playing hockey again, but we're down 5-3 heading into the third period. Canada scores 2 goals to tie it. And then with 34 seconds left in the game, Paul Henderson scores for Canada. The single greatest moment in the history of the sport of hockey. So folks, I'd even go so far as to say it is important to remember things like the 1972 Canada-Russia hockey series. And I definitely think more broadly it's important to remember history in general, especially as we're trying to live through these crazy times that you and I are trying to live through today. Which, by the way, I readily agree, these times have gone cuckoo bananas. As evidenced at the Four Nations face-off with the booing of the anthems. But whatever becomes of these tariffs or this nonsense about Canada becoming the 51st state, I would suggest remember your history, and in doing so ask yourself, do you really think today is going to be like it was with the Soviet Union in 1972? Literally the middle of a Cold War against a largely unknown alien enemy. For further context, the 1972 Canada-Russia Summit Series occurs at least chronologically within the same decade as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the legitimate threat of nuclear annihilation. I guess the moral might be, if you think you're dealing with hard times, and you may be, but believe me, there are people that came before you that dealt with harder. It was this series, 53 years ago, that mattered more than any other. At this time, there was a very, very real sentiment that this transcended just a sporting contest to see who had the best hockey team, but was a competition to see who had the best form of society. Now, the Four Nations face-off was meaningful, don't get me wrong. I'd even say meaningful to historic proportions. But the most meaningful hockey series of all time remains the 1972 Canada-Russia series. And in fact, folks, in my humble opinion, it is the greatest moment, not only in the history of hockey, but in the history of all Canadian sports. There's another very good and simple reason why this 1972 Canada-Russia series gets my vote as the greatest moment in the history of international hockey, and that is simply because it was the first. Prior to 1972, there was no such thing as best on best international hockey. Let me draw a parallel between achievement in science and achievement in sport. In science, greatness lies in the discovery. I mean, after all, Nobel Prizes are awarded to, and history immortalizes, those people who do things first. For example, let's say hypothetically Pythagoras never bothers unraveling the geometry of triangles, or Madame Curie never experiments with radiation, Watson and Crick never discover the DNA double helix. Undoubtedly someone else would have. Now, that in no way diminishes their original achievement. And in sport, here we find the 1972 Canada-Russia Summit Series. If the series never happens, undoubtedly, we are still playing international hockey today, but it was not until that moment, that discovery in 1972, when we all learned that people other than Canadians can play this game too. It is the discovery that changes the world, and it is the discoverers that are rightly glorified forevermore. So if the 72 Summit Series sits up here, never to be dethroned, where does this Four Nations face-off rank among the all-time greatest moments in Canadian hockey history? I am going to chicken out here just a little bit, but I am going to chicken out and just simply say that the Four Nations face-off belongs on the proverbial Mount Rushmore of great moments. So in the top four, and you can fight amongst yourselves about which event belongs in which spot. One of the other events in the top four absolutely has to be the 1987 Canada Cup, an event that has an enormous amount of sentimental value to me personally, because This was the first hockey that I ever watched. And I often wonder, actually, if this event wasn't so fantastic, so compelling, would I have turned into the hockey fan that I became? This lovely jersey that you see here, by the way, this is not some kind of a prop, folks. This is authentically from the era. Dale Hawerchuk is the name on the back of this jersey, and Hawerchuk and the other guys from that team, we're talking, folks, these were the heroes of my childhood. My brother and I had tapes of all those games. Yes, that's right, VHS tapes. This was in the days before DVD, and we watched those games so many times. In fact, I would say, at the risk of bragging, I'd consider myself to be scholarly when it comes to the 1987 Canada Cup. And speaking of scholarly, if you're interested in reading about this great historic event, I suggest you read this book by Ed Willis. Now, rounding out our top 4 great moments has to be the 2010 Winter Olympics. Now, I can't say I have a scholarly book suggestion for this event. However, I will suggest this one. It is indicative of the time. 2010 also just so happened to be the year our first child was born. Man, 2010, that was a good year. That was when the world was sensible, not like all this wackiness going on today. One last quick story about the 2010 Winter Olympics to illustrate how passionate a fan of Canadian hockey is yours truly. Everyone's got an answer, right, to the question, hey, where were you when Sid scored the golden goal? Well, my answer is not watching it. That's right. You see, when the States scored with 10 seconds left in the third period or whatever to tie that game, I decided I could not stand to watch the overtime. So I left from where I was watching the game. Sid scored the goal when I was sitting in my car driving home. I could not watch that overtime. Glad I stuck it out for last night, though. Now, if I can continue and actually add to my previous analogy about science and sport, I think these 3 events that I've just talked about, the Four Nations Face-Off, the 87 Canada Cup, and the 2010 Winter Olympics, those 3 events have a commonality behind why they are great that is actually very different from the reasons that make 1972 so great. And it is because of the same reasons why science differs from art. Because in art, greatness has nothing to do with discovery, right? For example, we don't say Da Vinci discovered the Mona Lisa. We don't say Shakespeare discovered King Lear. We don't say Orson Welles discovered Citizen Kane. In art, just like in the 87 Canada Cup, the 2010 Winter Olympics, and the 2025 Four Nations Face-Off, we find greatness that is entirely dependent upon the genius of the creators, in the absence of whom such greatness would never come into existence. There were no geniuses on the ice in 1972. There didn't need to be. But in these other 3 events, we had the unbelievable privilege of watching actually 4 geniuses entertain us in what could rightly be described as sporting masterpieces. Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, Sidney Crosby, and Connor McDavid. All geniuses. Just as surely as Pythagoras and Da Vinci and Shakespeare were geniuses, so too are these hockey players. How could they not be considered such? Of all the sports ever created by human beings, ice hockey is the most difficult to master. So what else would you call the people who are the greatest masters of the greatest sport? And the Four Nations Face-Off represents the greatest or the highest aesthetic ever achieved by this greatest of sports, because the sport is always evolving for the better. The hockey they played in 87 was better than the hockey they played in 72. And the hockey they played in 2010 was better than the hockey they played in 87. And the hockey that we just witnessed was better than them all. But one final thing I want to say, actually about all four of the members of my Mount Rushmore of great moments in hockey history, something they all have in common with each other and have in common with art itself. And this might actually be the most important feature of art, that being its ability to draw emotion out of people. I think I heard once that the very reason why us humans evolved emotion was to help us better remember important things. I mean, we don't remember facts and figures and whatnot, but we do remember how we felt. And I think there are a lot of Canadians who are always going to remember this story of the 2025 Four Nations face-off, the time they played hockey at the highest level at which it was ever played. And there was this one guy, a hockey genius named Connor McDavid, who made them feel real good about being Canadian.